My latest book, Our Global Lingua Franca, an educator's guide to spreading English where EFL doesn't work. Sounds like a pretty boring
Da, da, da,
topic. Oh, you have it.
da.
Wow. Wow. I'm flattered. It seems like a very boring topic on the surface, like how to teach English better. And it is quite unusual, I think, for me. I don't usually write on this subject, right? A lot of
Hmm.
people didn't even know that I was an experienced English teacher, foreign English teacher in many countries around the world. So some people were surprised when I said I was writing a book about how to teach English better because they're like, "Oh, what are your credentials? What do you know? You're not a linguist. You're not an English major."
And you were like, bro, I've been there, done that.
Right. I'm street smart in this regard. Of
Bought the
course,
t-shirt. Oh, this would make a good t-shirt design.
yeah, so part of it, of course, is just giving straight advice, like, hey, here's what works and what doesn't work, and trying to actually get people, with to have a useful degree of fluency in English,
Hmm.
conversational fluency, or better, maybe even true fluency. Um, but more of it, I would say, like at least the first half of it is more just about the sociological implications behind this really poor quality job that the entire world seems to be doing at teaching people to use English as a functional
Yeah,
language.
it's quite disheartening.
Yeah, I was just amazed when I took English teaching jobs in many countries on other sides of the planet, in almost every continent, that just the same obvious problems kept showing up. I couldn't believe, how can everyone be so bad at such a simple task? It's not rocket surgery or
You
brain
love
science,
saying that.
right?
You like saying stuff like that.
Like it's the year 2024. We should know how to teach a language by now, right?
We're still in the times after and God split the whatever it is. I don't remember the exact quote. I think you mention it. Split the languages of the world and said, "Fuck all you humans."
That's
Well,
the
this
Tower
God
of
character sounds
Babel.
like a piece of shit. Hope he
There's
dies or
literally a
goes to
picture
hell.
of the Tower of Babel on the book cover you just showed to the camera. Tower of
Yeah.
Yes, that one. When
Ta-da!
it's a myth that's shared among many cultures. Actually, it's not strictly a biblical one, although that's true of many of the stories in the Bible. Christians don't like to admit that, but many of their cherished biblical parables and stories have actually shown up in many, many cultures throughout history, right? And it's this idea that at a certain point, some group of gods, or the god, depending on how many gods you believe in, got upset when too many humans were collaborating and trying to accomplish something that humans should not have been able to accomplish. That
Fuck's
did
sake,
not
this
approve of.
bullshit again.
Yeah, yeah.
It sounds like a right
It really
wanker.
makes God sound like the bad guy if you think about it. Like, oh fuck, these guys are too smart and they're working together too well. I better make it impossible for them to collaborate. I better confuse their languages and spread them around the earth so that they can't work together anymore because they're becoming too powerful. They're
Well,
powerful
you can't
over
confuse a
9,000.
language. A language doesn't have a brain.
Right. That now the single biggest thing preventing the human race from collaborating, and as well as it could, is the fact that we can't all speak the same language. Um,
Yeah.
I tried to imagine what a world would look like that if you changed nothing else about how much we know, the technology we have access to, the present state of our politics and economy, how much about the world would improve, both materially and like philosophically, um, if everybody could just communicate flawlessly. How many misunderstandings would be cleared up? How much more commerce, mutually beneficial commerce, would occur? How many problems that are currently very difficult or impossible to solve would quickly be solved if everyone could just communicate better?
How
Yeah.
many fewer horrendous wars?
Yeah, of course, there's an argument to be made that many of these things wouldn't change because they're not just based on misunderstandings. Assholes are still going to be assholes and make war with each other. But clearly, many of the
Well,
problems.
they would try to, but the good would have more of a way of combating it because it would be able to organize
Sure.
more.
And we as the human race would probably have a much stronger shared sense of identity that was easier to transcend boundaries of culture. Right. I know, um, I live in Armenia currently. Very recently, Armenia has been attacked repeatedly by Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, which has a long history of happening. And the whole world doesn't really seem to care because nobody knows anything about Armenia or has any strong ties to Armenia. So almost every
And the Azeri populace is being propagandized to by its government and being led to believe a ton of bullshit. And Azeris don't naturally learn English, do they, growing up?
I don't know. I've never been to Azerbaijan, and I don't personally know any Azeris. I don't believe.
Uh,
I imagine they probably have a similar level of basic English education that doesn't really actually result in practical conversational
Probably.
fluency. Because
One
most
wonders if
countries have that.
one wonders if they were to be raised properly learning English and like having access to, various materials from around the world, if they might have a different perspective on what their government is doing rather than just their government's propaganda.
Yes, Azerbaijan is a heavily propagandized country, probably on par with China and North Korea, based on what
Fucking hell.
I've seen. They have strong revisionist, falsified history, and you can even see it when people try to engage in debates online. It's so strange. It's like every single Azeri commenter repeats the same lines anytime a certain subject is brought up. They all just immediately say the same things like they've been trained to. And it's real people, not bots that are like, actual
Ooh,
software bots. It's just people who have been repeatedly told the same things over and over and always exactly the same word. It's very,
makes me think
very
there's a connection between language acquisition and ideological possession, or where you learn language from and how you learn it, and being possessed by your ideology. Like, the more limited your language ability may be. I don't know, just had a thought. It's not quite a full thought there, but if they all come out with the same stuff, then it feels like they've had a single source of like where their language is coming from, sort of thing. Well, the government, I guess that would be.
You're referring to linguistic relativity or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, how the way we use language influences the way we think and
I mean, something
vice
similar
versa.
to it, but
I haven't done a controlled study on this subject, sorry, but it seems pretty obvious that the way you learn to use language influences the way you think because language is our primary tool of thought. It's obviously not the only thing that influences how you think, but it's a major one. And so if you only speak a very limited language, then your thoughts will be very limited. Or if you are repeatedly exposed to only certain limitations of a language that it by itself is not inherently very limited, but you're trained to use it in a very limited way, then obviously that's going to affect your worldview and your cognition. So that's one of the strong arguments I make in the first chapter of our Global Lingua Franca, saying, I can't tell you how many people I have known around the world who credit their ability to think freely and have like a broad worldview to the fact that they learned English. And that when they talk to their native countrymen, including many people here in Armenia, when they talk to Armenians who don't speak English, who only speak Armenian, or even those who speak Russian, which is certainly a larger language than Armenian, it's like they have different minds. That's how they put it. I've talked to a lot of these people that those who only speak Armenian are basically cut off from the entire world. They live in this tiny bubble with a tiny limited worldview, and it's so hard to talk to them on the same level.
mm,
So their words, not mine. Um,
yeah, I think I remember this from the book.
yeah,
It was
like
maybe a few weeks ago.
it would almost sound like very racist for me to be making these observations about them, right? Like very demeaning for me to come in and say, you people are so simple because you don't speak English, the best language in the world. This is what they tell me, the Armenians who learn English. And I've heard very similar things in many other countries that I've taught in China, parts of Latin America, parts of Europe, even.
Oh, so I think you mentioned this in chapter one, maybe briefly, why English as the why is English your pick for the global lingua franca universal language rather than say a language which is um what is it, Mandarin is has more people who know it as their first language, at least something like that.
Mandarin, and I believe also Spanish. I don't know the current numbers, but possibly Spanish too, both have more native speakers, but English has a much larger number of total speakers. So even if we were just evaluating based on practicality, like if we just had to pick one language right now for everyone to learn English, would be the obvious winner just because the most people speak it, and more importantly, it is the most widespread. There may be a lot of Mandarin speakers, but they're almost entirely limited to China and the surrounding areas, right? There are a lot of Spanish speakers, but it's mostly Latin America and Spain, right? Whereas English speakers can be found in virtually every country, even surprisingly undeveloped ones. I learned that while I was traveling around the world throughout my 20s. I've been to 50 countries. I never couldn't find English speakers, no matter where I went, or someone who knew someone who could translate, like, going into some guest house in some backward town in some impoverished country. Maybe they don't speak English, but they know someone who they can call who can translate or who can come over and help translate, right? Like that was always the case. I was always somehow able to communicate just by speaking English the majority of the time. You cannot do that with Spanish or Mandarin or Russian.
As well as that, from your do you have much experience with other languages? Do you know much about them other than English?
I speak pretty good Spanish. I've been learning Armenian for 5 years without much success for reasons I could go into that are relevant to the book and what I'm talking about, how we learn languages. Um, and mostly I just talk to other language enthusiasts and linguists and people who speak other languages that I don't to get their sense of what the language is like. And from what I've gathered, English generally offers far greater options for self-expression than most other common world languages do.
That
Which,
ties into what I was getting to, which is from your understanding of other languages, is English overall the best language of the ones you're aware of, at least,
yeah,
would you
obviously,
say?
I can't make that fair comparison. Even if I spoke three languages fluently, that wouldn't be nearly enough to make,
Of the ones you know, at least. So you
definitely,
mentioned
yes.
Spanish, an attempt at Armenian.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, yeah, or well, I've taught lots of people coming from other languages, which is part of what gives me kind of a little view into how they think. Like, I teach a lot of Russian speakers learning English, and it's so interesting to me how they always phrase things in these very fixed, awkward ways that I can't be sure how this comes across when they say it in Russian, but they have a very hard time adapting the way they speak when switching to English. And I can always immediately tell what
Blimey.
kind of mistakes a Russian speaker is going to make when they're learning English. It's always the same because they've been trained to think in certain very limited ways, repeating the same words over and over again when they're speaking English. It's very interesting to me. It really makes me wonder like what's going on in their head and what their worldview is like when they're speaking Russian, because I'm just seeing how it translates to English and how limited it is.
There also appear to be certain things that you can, like, the people from Asian countries who have learned English in their native countries seem to get wrong, or
Yeah.
like suboptimally.
Yeah, like there are certain prominent pronunciation errors, which is mostly just due to not having a similar sound in the language. Like,
Yeah,
mostly Asians
like
with, for
the L and
example,
R
more,
stuff.
right?
Yeah,
Russians with V and W frequently. There are a few others. One I always find is funny. Spanish speakers will often add the E vowel sound before words that start with S because they have words like escuela for school or español for Spanish or
uh,
estúpido for stupid. And recently I've had Iranian guests stay in my house and they do the
estúpido.
same thing. Yeah, estúpido instead of stupid. Iranians do the same thing. I didn't know that. I hadn't really been exposed to Farsi much, but they do the same Spanish sound. And you have to point it out to them because they don't consciously realize they're doing it even though they hear English speakers just saying
I mean,
Spanish, school, stupid, stay, still. They like unconsciously add in the sound because they're so used to pairing them.
still.
Yeah. Stay, still. Yeah. Right.
One word
Stupid.
related one I've noticed with people from Asian countries is that they seem to be taught the word seldom instead of the word rare or rarely, like as the common word instead of it, which is ironic because
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
use the word rarely more commonly,
So what
and they
happens is
get that one for some
either
reason.
there's a direct translation from the native language that gets overused in English that doesn't really fit quite as well, even if it technically makes sense. The Russians do this a lot. Like I was saying, the words I hear from Russians a lot are situation, possibility, and consequence. Whenever
To
I
be
start,
fair, at
yeah.
least those first two are kind of big ones, especially situation, right?
No, those are valid words to use, but they overuse them. Like they use them in places
Uh,
where there would clearly be better words to use.
but I
Situation.
mean, like, kind of feels like situation is hard to overuse. Could you give an example?
Um,
Situation seems to be a very
that's a very
generally
general, very
useful word.
neutral word. You probably wouldn't use it in like a closer, more intimate or casual situation.
Can you think of anything? See, that's what I mean.
Like
It's
you
so
wouldn't
comfortable a
describe
word.
a a dinner date with your wife as a situation, right?
They were interesting.
Yeah,
Okay,
that
there
everything's a
you are, mate.
situation to them.
That
Everything
one.
is a possibility. Everything is a consequence or has a consequence. And I
That
can't,
one, I think actually English people should use more often.
that everything is
Would
a
be
consequence?
useful.
Maybe.
No, not saying. I mean the word, just consequence. Using it more often.
Uh,
Talking about things causing things.
well, why not just say like the result or something? Um,
Um,
my point is that frequently they don't even believe me when I tell them, what you're saying makes sense. I understand you, but that's not the way English speakers talk. It sounds weird and technical and formal and off-putting when you say everything that way. You need to learn some alternatives, some other ways of
why do you
expressing.
think they are thrown by that? Do you suspect it has to do with their training in English, where they're
Yeah.
so used to how they've been taught, and that it seems to make a lot of sense to them? Or
Yeah, so if it's not just a direct translation that they're overusing, it's often that their schools and their teachers teach them the wrong things. And then they don't believe you when you tell them that their school taught them the wrong
it's
things.
my first language, people. I know what
Yeah,
I'm
I
talking about.
can't tell you how many I've gone into schools here in Armenia for high school students or university students. They don't believe me when I point out their very basic English errors. They think that they're
Another
fluent in English.
possibility, for that. Could
For
it
that
be that
situation and its
they're
consequence.
reluctant to change it if they know that it's at least technically correct, that it's like a big kind of activation energy gap, like, oh, but this, I already have this,
Right. So that's
don't.
where you lose all that nuance that comes with communication, all those connotations of choosing the right word in the right situation. Situation. Now I can't
See, I told you
word.
situation was.
Sure. But if I were saying situation in every sentence, you'd start to notice it sounds a bit odd,
Sure,
right?
yeah. They overuse a word that's hard to overuse. That's how bad it
Right.
is.
Right. And when clearly, any native English speaker, not even a particularly articulate one like a professional writer or speaker, would have, four or five other alternatives they could use in different situations that would sound more appropriate, right?
Can you whip out some of those alternatives for us?
Happening, endeavor,
Event, because you
event.
said like dinner date with wife.
Yeah, sure.
Context,
Gathering.
if we're talking about on a more abstract level, I'm not sure. It kind of sounds like they wouldn't necessarily use situation where they could use context, because it sounds more concrete how they use it, like a thing in the
Yeah,
world.
it always sounds with Russian speakers and some other Eastern Europeans that have related languages, it always sounds very technical and formal. And again, it's really hard for me to evaluate whether that's just how it sounds in English or it really reflects how they're trained to think in this very concrete technical.
Uh,
But I've talked to, Russians who are truly fluent in English and know how to use it well, and they kind of agree with my assessment. Like that's just how Russians learn to think, right? So how much of that is cultural and how much of it is due to the limits of the language? Is it
Uh,
a consequence of the situation?
Very clever.
It's a
Possibility
possibility. It's
also
a
seems to
consequence of
be
the
one that's
situation.
hard to overuse. Like, what other words are there that they use it in place of, sort of thing? Like, I'm failing to think of where you could use it and like it would be better to use a different word. Can you give any examples?
Um, like in a really casual setting, they'll say things like, "Is it a possibility to meet next week? Is it a possible? It's possible?"
Oh, it's not just where it should be replaced by another word, it's where the whole sentence structure is
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, no,
off.
yeah, everything. And I keep
Like,
saying,
rather than is it a possibility to, they could
yeah,
go be saying something like, would it be possible to, more
well, that
flowing,
too. But
more
even then, like,
English
why
language
wouldn't you?
sounding?
What you really mean when
Would
you
we be
say that,
able to,
right?
something like that?
When you say and you ask if
Could
something
we?
possible, you're asking literally, can this thing happen? Right? Like in
Feasible,
the
I
in the
guess, is
physical
another
sense.
more
Like, yeah, is it
precise one.
possible for pigs to fly? Can that thing happen or not? Is it possible to travel back in time, right?
Hmm.
That's really what that means, right? But most of the time when they say that in much more casual context, what they actually mean is more like, would you mind if this happened? Are you available at this time? Are you okay with this? Do you
To be
approve of
fair,
this? Do you prefer
English
this?
people, maybe especially British people, do that sort of thing, like where you tiptoe around it more to give people like more of an out sort of thing. Like you don't want to tread on any toes and like don't want to come across stronger than necessary. Like not as directly approaching the thing and saying what you want. Could you do this for me, sort of thing? Like, would it be possible for you to do this for me if you could? Blah blah.
No,
Like,
they're not doing it that way though. That
yeah,
would be a
I'm just
subtle
saying, like,
nuance of communication, the way we change the way we talk about things to convey certain emotions beyond just the direct literal meaning of what we're saying. That's what they're missing. And that's what I find many languages don't have as much possibility. As many
every
options. But yeah, now it's stuck in my head. I'm going to be inserting it in every sentence.
it's kind of like, to be fair with those two words, they are pretty
Oh, no,
common.
again, and that's why
But
it's so hard to teach this, though, because if it were just wrong, you could just say to them, no, don't say that. That's wrong.
yeah.
Um, it's the hard part is teaching them, no, sometimes it's okay. But if it's the only thing you know how to say and you can't differentiate between when it would be more or less appropriate to say it, you're not really using English like an
Hmm.
English speaker. You're
Yeah,
miscommunicating.
your thoughts are quite limited. And that's not even Sapir-Whorf, that's more general in that if you have fewer concepts you can actually use, then you have fewer concepts you can use. So your thought is more limited. That's broader than
Yeah.
Sapir-Whorf. That's just like you don't have as much conceptual range.
Yeah. Like I know, I'm pretty good at English. I'm a writer and a teacher.
What?
Yeah, I'm okay, right? Better than most people, I suppose. But I'm still constantly learning new words and new
Hashtag
phrases
samesies.
and new ways of thinking about things. And when I do, like when I read a book that really challenges me and teaches me a new way of thinking about something, I start talking and writing differently. My paradigm has evolved as a result of the words and phrases I've been exposed to. So if that applies even just for my native language, which I'm already quite good at, um, like why wouldn't that also apply even more so to learning a whole new language that has many
Mm.
more options for expression than whatever your native one is?
So I think you briefly touch on something like this in the introduction and or chapter one, but so people who learn English start to use like um, English words in their thinking, even in and speaking, even in their native language, right?
That has been my experience, yeah. If
Yeah.
there's not
So
really a
I
strong
wonder if
local equivalent, yeah, then they start thinking in English more because there's simply no other way that they can access these ideas.
so thinking in terms of like blue sky horizons long term, say if English becomes everyone's second language sort of thing. Not second necessarily, but like basically everyone in the world starts learning English. Do you think it will uplift all the other languages and that they start borrowing aspects of English or realizing that they have gaps in their own native languages and either directly filling them from English or like or sort of not directly, but like indirectly going, here's what we're missing something, and then doing something to fill it in. So, do you think longer term it's going to uplift the other languages of the world by everyone or most people, a lot more people becoming effectively native speakers in it and growing their thinking ability?
I think that if you removed all cultural and political pressures that kind of forced people to first learn just their native language and think primarily in it, a lot more people would just organically choose to use whatever language is most useful. I think
Hmm.
of languages like currencies. If you're stuck with a shitty local currency that is only used in your country, and someone gave the option of doing all your commerce in dollars or euros, why wouldn't you use dollars and euros? If you knew those could be spent, accepted, and received anywhere in the world.
But one difference is that if you have options between languages, it's not just for like a technical way of getting through life. Like they're also something that you can feel your use of and enjoy. Whereas currency is just a means to an end
Oh yeah,
rather
sure. No,
than
there will
one of
always
the
be
pleasures of
some
life.
artistic and cultural and linguistic value to every language that has ever existed. But the vast majority of people use language for a functional purpose, not just because they love the language or have some passion for it. Linguists
Okay, and not just that, but also like other language, like there are trade-offs between languages, whereas with currencies, there may be, but um, it's more on the level of not really. Whereas languages, it's like are kind of trade-offs. So like keeping your original language rather than just kind of jettisoning it completely, keeping its functions and also gaining all the functions of English is preferable. Whereas with currencies, I don't know if maybe um, I don't know if that suggests that one currency for the world would be useful. Certainly not in our current world. It would give certain governments way too much
Yeah,
power.
not
But
if it's enforced on everyone
yeah, not if
directly,
it's
but if it arose
enforced.
organically, sure. And that's what I'm
And
saying
I
about
guess
English
gold
too.
kind of is still that and has
Yeah,
been forever.
sure. Um,
Which, yeah, I guess that kind of is useful as a metaphor. Then gold is the global currency of the world, even still after it's been neutered. And maybe
Global
English
currency
needs to fill
franca,
it.
yes.
Yeah,
Um,
not the franc.
no, no, definitely not the franc. So
Yeah,
that's
so
kind of
maybe
what I'm
that's the place
saying
for
too.
English.
I'm not at all advocating that we force everyone to learn English, which is ironic because that's what they're doing in most of these schools. English is mandatory in most of the places I've been for years and years, like up to 10 years. But they do
That's
such
got
a
to be a
bad,
massive amount of the problem.
yeah,
That it's mad. It's
yes.
like it's one of those like laws of the world, like um, like X's law sort of thing. Like you make it mandatory, however noble the purpose, however good the thing you try and make mandatory, you're gonna get the least valuable version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that's called the law of bureaucracy. I've heard that term before. When you try to enforce something instead of letting people organically choose it, you get the worst possible implementation of that thing. Which is either, yeah, just very, very inefficient or actively counterproductive. It accomplishes the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish, which is what I would say is the case with most of the mandatory English classes. That either they learn just the very basics of English slowly over the course of about 10 years, or they actively hate English or learn bad, wrong English that they think is correct English. And the point is, it doesn't work. Yet, in spite of that, English continues to rapidly spread as the global lingua franca because people still continue to choose it anyway, simply because they see how useful it is, right? In spite of the government's best efforts
Frozen a bit.
to fuck up English education, it keeps growing anyway.
It's one of the things that I would figure, at least, that governments around the world are at least half earnest about. Like, if they make English learning mandatory in schools, it's like the members of the government who have like thought about it and concluded that it needs to be mandatory, they're actually trying to do good, I would think, rather than it's about power for the most part. But it still fucks it up.
Yeah. However good their intentions may be, they need to recognize we have enough data at this point to clearly draw the conclusion it's not working as intended. Let's figure out why. And the answer isn't
In the
just to
book,
keep doing more of what doesn't work.
do you talk much about how it's mandation? Is that a word? It could easily be a word. We can do that with English because we know what it
Sure.
means. It's
Okay.
mandatoriness, mandation. Do you talk much, if at all, about how it's mandation corrupts the learning of it, like
Yes.
in itself, essentially,
Yes.
and it gives you a bureaucratized,
Quite a bit.
lowest possible version of it?
For lots of
Good.
reasons. One, there's plenty of research that shows that people learn languages when they are organically immersed in it, when they see practical reasons, when they want to watch the same TV shows as their friends and the shows are in English. I list plenty of references in my book, which I can't name offhand, but that's not even like up for debate. Like everyone just knows that, right? So what that means is you can't force people to do something to want to do something, right? If they do it because you're forcing them, it's because they have some external reason that like you've either threatened them with punishment or you said, I'll give you a piece of candy if you memorize these English words, right? But they have to see the inherent worth of learning the language that's somehow aligned with their own values, and that's different for every person. You could just make them hate learning English because you force them to study it in a way that isn't fun, and they're much less likely to learn something that they hate. Sure, maybe they'll give you the right answers on the tests and pass to avoid the punishment, but that's not learning a language. That should be obvious by now.
I've just remembered something I wanted to bring up. So, learning English as a foreign language feels a bit different from learning other subjects like maths and stuff, in that it's not to learn it well, it's not just kind of you have the motivation, and like you can't really learn it from books, so you can't just learn it by motivation, essentially, where a motivated student of basically any other subject, I figure books for the most part, they're motivated and maybe some like help from people, but motivation seems to be the key. Whereas with English, because it's a language, it has to come from people, not just books. Motivation is not the one essential aspect of learning it in that sense, like with maths or sciences or something, because it can't be learned from books, something like that, right? So
Well,
you need
I
more
won't
than
say
just
that
the
it can't be
motivation. You
learned
need,
from books, but for most people, it definitely won't be learned effectively from books. There are certain people who learn
I
things
mean,
that way.
effectively, like
Yeah,
actual English as English people speak it.
right. No, the vast majority of people will learn best just through practical immersion, just by people around them using English to accomplish basic communicative tasks. That's how we all learn our native languages. No baby studies an English book in America. They learn to speak English, right? And then maybe they study the grammar later if they actually care about those things, right? But 99% of people who never study English grammar and just were immersed in English speak English correctly 99% of the time. And that's all you need to be to communicate what you mean and be received as intended almost all the time, right? That should be the goal, basic conversational fluency. The people who care about really perfecting the grammar and really expanding their options for communication for whatever reason can go on to do that. And maybe studying from books is the best way to do that. But if you can't even get to that basic level of being able to say what you mean and be received as you intend the majority of the time, then all of that is irrelevant.
Yeah, you just made me realize even English people, like, we definitely don't communicate perfectly in English, whether it's objective imperfections, or just simply not knowing the audience well enough to know what we need to say to get the communication across. So even English people aren't going to get that perfect. So I guess that's good news for foreign learners if they can accept that they don't have, it's not perfection they're aiming for,
Yeah, it's not
sort of
prescriptive.
thing,
You know,
right?
I'm not at all saying you have to learn English this way because it's the way they said so in the dictionary or whatever,
But I
right?
mean, not just prescriptivism versus non. I mean, like, that you're learning to communicate, and even then, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just that how it's being learned is imperfect enough that it's still like crap,
Right.
sort of thing,
So I
as
define,
opposed to good but imperfect.
right. In my book, I define good English as English which is interpreted, received as intended, or at least close enough to how it was intended. And how specific, how precise that needs to be depends entirely on the communication context. In a science lab, precision is probably pretty goddamn important, right?
Hmm.
In a casual
Because
conversation,
explosions,
yeah,
etc.
ordering a cup of coffee, probably not as important to get every word exactly right with exactly the right connotation, and your delivery and your body language. All of these things affect the communication, right?
Hmm.
But many things that are neglected completely in the traditional English class are important, like tone of voice, how comfortable and competent you sound. Those things affect even casual conversations. Do you sound angry? Do
Hmm.
you sound rude? Do you sound sympathetic? Do you sound jovial? All of those things affect how people interpret the
Jovial is
words
a
you're
very
saying.
nice word.
Yeah, that's a good word to know in English. I recommend adding it to your repertoire. But those things are completely neglected because usually what happens is they just memorize as many words as they can, but not really learning
Hmm.
how to use those words effectively. Why? Because it's easy to test how many words someone has memorized, right? And that's their goal. It's just, does it look like we're learning English? Can we test for this easily?
Say you have an adult, okay, maybe two different examples. Say you have, in one example, an adult who's like 40, very rich, can do whatever they want, doesn't speak English. They have a ton of money and like connections and stuff. They could do quite a lot. What would you say would be the number one best way for them to learn English to at least close to a native level, if not a fully native level?
Well, I can give you a few examples from my experience. One is just watch a lot of English American TV or British. BBC is fine too. They have a few good shows. Um, but the
Without subtitles?
no, with subtitles, if that helps, if that's the stage you're at where reading and hearing at the same time helps you understand, then sure. And if you get good enough eventually that you can do it entirely through the audio, then do that too.
I
Um,
mean, like with or without their own language subtitles?
again, if that helps you understand, then sure. Until you no longer need that, that's fine. That's how most people learn English without any formal education, rich or poor, whatever. They just get exposed enough to English language media, right? Friends, for instance, the show Friends, the music of the Beatles or whatever pop star is popular at the moment. That's how people learn English the majority of the time. If you really want to get good in a proper way, and you have all the money in the world, hire a native speaking private tutor to come live in your house. That's what I
What?
did in China.
So, one thing I'm thinking is that for the fullest level of immersion possible, if you got the money and like ability to do it, how about dropping yourself into an English speaking country and just
Yeah. If you're brave enough
try
to
and
do
live
it.
there for six
That
months
I
and see
I
what
have
you can
not
do?
taken a Spanish class or hired a Spanish tutor. I went to live in Costa Rica when I was 18 and I dated a local woman who barely spoke English. Within a year, I was conversationally fluent in Spanish.
Way.
I could be a lot better at Spanish. I haven't used it in a long time, and obviously I could study the grammar and get, like literary with it like I am with English, but I don't really need to. It's enough that I could go back to Latin America anytime and live comfortably.
A family with like young children, maybe Let's say they're just past the age, like just past the complete babyhood where they could learn native English as easily as like where you pick up your own first native language and it becomes language. So let's say like I don't know, from 3 or something. They have a ton of money and could drop whatever they're doing and do whatever. What is the number one way, or maybe 2 or 3 ways, you would suggest for them to give their child let's say they want to go for as close to native English as possible, instilling in their kids?
Okay. So, like I said, fill your house with English language media. Hire a native English speaking tutor to come live in your house. I did this with a family in China, a very wealthy family. I was going to leave the country after just a few months of being there because I hated China with a passion because it's a very authoritarian propagandist science fiction experiment, like something out of 1984. I didn't realize that before I went there.
Oh, we're both gonna get executed or something for this, but go
Yeah,
on.
this video will be blacklisted in China now, of course.
Well, YouTube is anyway,
Yeah.
because China.
But before
Help China! Yeah, sorry, go on.
did you know that their leader looks like Winnie the Pooh? Have you heard this? Have you seen this? What's his name?
Yes.
Xing.
And Winnie the
What
Pooh
is his name? I don't
cosplays
know.
have been banned at convention like Blizzard conventions or whatever.
Yeah. Have you heard of Tiananmen Square, by the way?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So now we've covered all our bases. Um,
Tank Man.
Before I was ready to leave China because I hated it, I had started tutoring this 13-year-old girl, very bright young woman. And after even just a few weeks, her mother said, like, she's learned more English from you than she has in all of her schooling, basically. And I said, oh, I'm going to leave the country because I fucking hate it here. And she said, oh my God, please don't leave. Like, what are we going to do if you leave? We finally found someone who can teach our daughter English. And so she paid me a pretty handsome sum to just come live with them for the next few months and teach
Wealthy,
her 2 kids.
smart people are great
Yeah,
when you have something to offer them.
yes.
Help me. Here
That
are
is an
money.
economic concept that I learned very early on in my travel is that you can solve any problem as long as you can do something for someone who's in a position to help you. Division of labor, essentially. And so yeah,
Starting with mental labor.
it was really good to have a skill that was highly valued in that specific situation where these people, again, being as wealthy and well connected as they were, they hadn't found a way to get their children to learn English well until they just happened to meet me. Um, and so that was a very rewarding experience, just saying that I could at least accomplish some small amount of good in that horrible situation and play that role for them. But that's probably the best they could have done under the circumstances, besides just immediately leaving China and moving to California, which was their goal. That's why they
I'm
had.
guessing that would be the number one, because then you get the immersion.
Yeah, but there were
And
restrictions
still,
on them leaving.
yeah,
That's
number
otherwise
one
they
if
could have
you
done
can.
that.
And of course,
Most people
China,
can't do that,
you
of
can't.
course, right?
China.
So you have to find some other way to supplement your life with English immersion.
Yeah.
Internet, English language media are everywhere now, even in the poorest, least developed places. I knew kids in Ghana who didn't have indoor plumbing. They had to carry in buckets of water from a communal spigot, but they had
I
smartphones and
will
could
go
watch
to
English
fetch the
YouTube videos.
water till the day that I am grown. End of Jungle Book.
Okay, I don't remember that, but nice.
Ah, damn. Iconic.
Um, yeah, like they didn't have indoor plumbing, but they had smartphones with YouTube and English videos, and they spoke good English. Like
Mm.
so that's the
Sounds like one of
world.
those science fiction novels where some things are massively ahead, and then there's some like really retrogressive stuff that like
Retrofuturism,
I'm
like Star Wars. We can
what's
fly into hyperspace, but our computers look like they're from the 1970s. If you could choose a single skill that if everyone magically learned that would improve their quality of life, their options for living the way they want and acquiring the things they want materially, intellectually, whatever, culturally, what single skill would have that biggest positive impact on the world?
Well, I think I have an idea of your answer given the
Yeah, it
context,
should
but
be.
I would think it might be something like um, channeling logic tools into problem solving, knowing how to use logic and problem solving.
That is a pretty good answer. Um, that's a good
Now
answer.
tie that into
Yeah.
your answer.
Um, so and I do even list in the book some alternatives like, hey, basic arithmetic is pretty goddamn useful, but most people know basic arithmetic, so that's not something most people need to learn. I would say the ability to communicate well with others. And presently, again, we take this for granted if we speak a major world language, and there are several major world languages that are almost as useful as English, right? Like Spanish and Russian and Arabic and French and a few others. The Germans really seem to like the German language, but no other country speaks it. But they do seem really passionate about their language. I'll have to figure out why. Um, but I would say if you could, Hmm?
The Attack on Titan opening, it has German in it, and it's very like gripping. It makes you feel kind of, I want to say patriotic, even though we don't live there. So that might be, it feels like a very patriotic sort of charge forward sort of sounding language, something like that.
my point was that the average person anywhere in the world, under any cultural, economic circumstances, would benefit most by being able to communicate well with the rest of the world. If-
Tying that into my thing, I guess that's like bringing everyone else's ability to do logic into
Yes,
solving your
yes.
problems and their problems, everyone's
So
problems.
logic is great. It's wonderful. It's absolutely essential, but it's limited to just your mind, your mental processes. Communication gives you access to everyone else's mind and mental processes and the products of their existence, which is what we call an economy, commerce.
I guess put both the one you mentioned and the one I mentioned together, and that kind of covers it. That's like
If you can think clearly and communicate your thoughts with others and receive their thoughts well, then yeah, that's pretty much
you
everything a human
can get
being
you
needs.
can get everything that a human being can possibly get from the world, something like that.
I mean, yeah, that's the history of humanity, isn't it? The history of innovation, all our development is that essentially.
0 to 1 from your own mind, and then 1 to arbitrarily large up to
Yeah, infinite.
infinity
Yeah,
with
basically. Yeah.
communication.
And you benefit immediately, even if you're a complete fucking idiot, of which there are many in the world. Um, you still,
Preach.
just by having the most basic communication abilities, can receive the products, the benefits of people much smarter and more skilled than you, or people who came many generations before you. You immediately benefit by being born into the same world as them and being able to communicate with them and the offshoots of their existence. That's how a
And
standard
can
of living
become
is.
not an idiot as a result.
Sure, hopefully. Hopefully. But
Can
that's why we don't live in the
become.
Stone
It's a
Age anymore.
possibility. It's a possibility to
I
become
don't
that.
know how a computer works, but somehow I am talking to you through one, though we are several countries away. I have benefited from the work, the output, the
Hmm.
communication efforts of people smarter than me who came before me.
I guess this ties into the stuff you talk about in Everyone is an Entrepreneur sort of thing.
Sure, my economics book. That's the whole point of an economy, so that I could benefit from everything everyone else in the world does, and they can benefit from what I do. Well,
I
it
am the
seems like the
best
topic is
interviewer.
about why is improving English education so much more important than most people, even most English teachers, will ever realize. I hope we
Yeah,
sufficiently answered that and why I felt like I had to write this book after seeing how just awful the English education is in virtually every country in the world, and how, I've only taught in about 12 or so of the countries that I've been to, But I've now shown the book to people who have taught in many other countries, and they almost universally agree with everything. And say, I show it to some of my present English students, and they say, yeah, you're describing exactly what it was like for me learning English in school and why I still can't speak perfectly because of all the shit you talk about here. So, I generalized from my own anecdotal experiences, but it does seem that I have latched onto something that is a pretty general truth around the world. Maybe not everywhere, but in many
Oh,
places that it's certainly worth addressing.
I've got one. How does it tie in to all the other books you've written? Why are you the person who's written? Why are you the author of these other books, which aren't about the same or a similar topic, also the author of our Global Lingua Franca? What's the common theme running through all of
Yes.
them that make
I
you
do
want to
I
talk
do get
about
that question a lot. Yeah. Because it does seem like I write on a lot of totally unrelated things, which, reasonably might cause someone to question my credentials. Like, how are you qualified to write about all these things that seem to have nothing to do with each other? Well, for one, you can just be a smart person who learns a lot of things. That's possible. You don't have to specialize in just one thing. But there are a lot of commonalities running between the things I write about, like business and personal development and travel and now language education. And I realized a long time ago that the common theme was that everything I write about is about improving the individual's ability to self-actualize and self-express. And the language we use is just one critical component of that. Understanding economics is like that same thing on a sociological level, understanding how the human race interacts materially to exchange mutually beneficial ideas and physical products. That's an economy. A language is part of an economy. It's how we interact and exchange. A business is an expression of your productive output and your values, right? I wrote a book called Travel as Transformation, which wasn't a conventional
plug it.
what?
I said plug it.
Plug it. Yes. I'm happy to self-promote. But the point is that it wasn't just a conventional travel book, like, hey, isn't travel great? Don't you wish you had my life, kids? Um, which is, yeah, like 90% of travel books, right? It was more like, here's all the unexpected things I learned about myself in the world as a result of living nomadically for 10 years, like all the ways I grew as a person, including some very challenging things like what I mentioned about China, and some very dark and
Fuck
difficult periods.
China.
Yeah, fuck China, exactly. So again, what's the common theme among all these things? Self-discovery, self-actualization, and self-expression. And the next book I write on romantic idealism is taking that same exact theme into the domain of romance and love and sex and intimacy and everything connected to that.
And would you say that, so that's the positive aspect of the theme. Would you say that there's an in spite of, and I think I know it based on our previous discussions. So going towards self actualization and self improvement in spite of or pushing against.
I think the antagonist you're trying to identify would be culture or group identification, which is
That's the one
antithetical
I'm
to
looking for. Yeah.
individual expression. Yes.
The limits of culture that
That was the
are
subtitle of
based on
Travel's
you.
Transformation: Conquer the Limits of Culture to Discover Your Own Identity. I gave a TED talk here in Armenia, in Yerevan, in 2019 called Who Are We When the World Stops Telling Us Who to Be? Is there a you that can become stronger and more expressed than the expectations of your group identity of what your culture expects you to be? Who would you be if they were not telling you who to be? What precedes all that? Yeah, so that's why something seemingly as simple and benign and uninteresting as how to be a better English teacher is actually a very profound and transformative and revolutionary thing to learn about if you are an aspiring or practicing English teacher or just someone passionate about language and the world
And about people breaking through the limits of culture
to discover their own identities.
to,
Yes.
yeah, to self actualize.
To figure out who they are when the world stops telling them who to be.
And yeah, of course, that ties into the thing you mentioned about their languages being limiting and limiting their thought all that Sapir-Whorf stuff, and probably deeper than Sapir-Whorf. That English, I would think, and I think you think, is probably the best tool for cognition out of languages that you're aware of.
Certainly that I'm aware of. Again, I can't, fairly objectively make that assessment. But it's definitely a significant improvement over many of the small, limited, diminished local languages that the vast majority of people are stuck thinking and perceiving the entire world in.
I wonder if local is part of the key to that, that because they're local, like Chinese is local just over a massive area, that like that's still a limitation and they get to be controlled far more by their culture and government because all those outside sources, you don't get Chinese speaking people from all over the world saying, oh, actually, this. You just get from within China one single place, and especially from their controlling
Right.
dictatorial or
How
semi-dictatorial
much
government.
is
English is very, what's the word?
broad,
Something
widespread,
like that. Like,
diverse? Diverse is
yeah, diverse might be it. Like, it's just that decentralized asset.
that is a
The
good
other
way to put it.
languages
Yeah,
are
there is no
decentralized.
single authority or single culture that gets to decide the limits of English because it is broken free of just one country or one part of the world determining how it's used. If there are a
Yeah,
billion Mandarin Chinese speakers, but they all are subject to the same cultural and local limitations, then really, what does that mean for the limits of how Mandarin Chinese can actually be used as a tool of thought? I don't know.
mm,
I claim to know the answers to these things, but it's interesting to speculate about.
yeah. This all suggests that I think that English is the clear choice, even if it weren't the case that it's the most widely spoken language. If you take everyone, both native and non-native, that it's the seemingly most decentralized, the most free language,
English
not controlled
is
by an
an
authority.
anarchic language,
Yes.
which is ironic considering that the reason it started to spread in the first place was because of colonization and it very
Funny how things work like that.
yes, but
Fuck
it's
the
like
British.
English is the American Revolution of languages. There's the tagline.